Welcome to the Black Table, Black Star Network. My name is Greg Carr, and I'm your host. Here at the Black Table, we devote an hour every Friday to exploring ideas and subjects of special importance to African people and others fighting to build a better society. If you've been following us so far, every week we add layers to understanding how we place ideas, figures, politics in larger and larger contexts, so we can understand that everything local is affected by the global, is affected by larger forces. And today we're taking the next step in that process, and it's a major step in that process. We're being joined today by Professor John Munro, who is at the University of Birmingham in England, a major scholar, worker, intellectual worker with expertise across the board dealing with social movements and intersections of race and U.S. imperial culture and international contexts. And we're here to discuss today, in particular, his 2017 book, The Anticolonial Front, The African American Freedom Struggle and Global Decolonisation, 1945 to 1960. This is a truly remarkable book. And we're welcoming to the Black Table today, Professor John Munro. John, thank you for taking some time to spend with us today, brother.
My honor to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You know, when I purchased this book, and I'm glad for those of you who purchased this book, it's now a paperback, right, John?
It is a paperback now, yeah.
Okay, because it was in hardback when it first came out. And, you know, my little HBCU professor salary, I'm in the academic bookstore. I'm saying, what is this? I picked it up and I couldn't put it down. So I had to get the book, man. I mean, it is truly a remarkable work. And if I understand correctly from what you've written, it began life as a dissertation. In fact, it began life apparently in a class you were in 2001, right? Where you actually encountered someone you actually got a chance to spend some time with, and that is, of course, the legendary Jack O'Dell. But before we get to any of that, help us understand some of your origins, man. Where you come from, and how did you get involved in this work, and how did you come to this intellectual work that produced the Anticolonial Front?
Yeah, great. Well, you know, I guess another way of putting that question is, how does this white guy from Canada come to writing about African American history in a broad global context? And I would say the short answer is my teachers. And I would say the longer answer is exactly one of the moments that you point to there that I kind of begin the book with, which is a really generative moment for me in terms of coming to this work and recognizing its significance. I was a returning student to finish off an undergraduate degree in the year 2001. And I took some history classes. I took a class on African American history with Professor Carr Ferguson at Simon Fraser University in Canada. And it was through that class that I thought it was an interesting topic. But what I came to see in that class was the centrality. You know, when you live in Canada, you know the United States is an important country in the world. That part's easy. But what I came to understand was the significance of the Black experience in the United States to the history of the world, and actually understanding understanding racism and understanding resistance in the US was a really key sort of component to unlocking world history and getting that kind of deeper sense of global politics, as well as obviously the very significant politics within the United States as well. So that's what led me ultimately to meeting Mr. O'Dell. Karen Ferguson, in one of her classes, we had a small seminar, me and a couple other students, and she invited us to meet with Mr. O'Dell. I didn't quite know who he was at the time in 2001, and we were reading Penny von Eschen's Race Against Empire, which is a remarkable book of its own, looking at the international anti-colonial dimensions of the Black freedom struggle around the mid-20th century. And reading that book with Jack O'Dell was just such a formative experience, because that book, argues very strongly that anti-communism in many ways kind of snuffed out the resistance struggle that was coming out of the 30s and into the 1940s through McCarthyism. And there's quite a bit to say about that. But reading it with Jack O'Dell, it was also very apparent that Mr. O'Dell had been, indeed bruised by anti-communism, but nonetheless very much weathered through it and continued on to have, a significant influence in a number of different really important places in social movements across the 20th century. And so that led me to my great good fortune to have an opportunity to be a research assistant for Jack O'Dell, organizing his papers primarily for some of them are at the Schomburg, and a lot of them are going to be at the Tamiment, so both in New York.
Oh, excellent. At NYU.
Yeah, exactly.
Glad to hear that. And then a lot of folks won't know John H. Jack O'Dell, but they will know his handiwork. I mean, I didn't know him either until I was an adult and realized, having worked on the Jesse Jackson campaign in '84 as a sophomore at Tennessee State, if you pull on Operation Push or Jesse Jackson or Martin Luther King and Brett, out falls Jack O'Dell. How does this guy become somebody we just don't hear about all the time? And you actually were his research assistant, John.
Yes, indeed. And what that meant, Greg, was that I would go over to his house, him and his partner, Jane Power, also an important historian, activist, and intellectual as well. And I would go over to their for a year. I went over to their house every week, and I would work with the papers and begin to organize stuff. And then after a couple hours of that, we'd have lunch in the living room. And then, it would often be like, oh, I found this, something about apartheid, say. And we would have, it would basically turn into like a lunchtime seminar for 2 hours. The lunches were long, and they were, as you can imagine, just absolutely profound. And so I just learned many, many things through those conversations. I'm really glad that Nikhil Singh organized some of Mr. O'Dell's writing and gave it that fantastic introduction, so people can have a way into Jack O'Dell's thought, because it just touches on and connects together so many different things.
Absolutely. In fact, I'm looking over here on the spine. I see it over on the shelf. And Nikhil Singh, who, of course, was very gracious in writing a blurb for you, which talks about the importance of your book, which, of course, takes us from the end of World War II up into what a lot of people think of as the traditional civil rights movement in the 1960s. But before we get there, and I want to ask you in a minute to just kind of give us a tease of the major theses of the text, you end up at one of the most important formations for thinking about, quote unquote, radical intellectual work in the contemporary moment, and that's the University of California, Santa Barbara. I mean, I teach Cedric Robinson's Black Movements in America every semester in my Introduction to African Studies class, and Howard Winan was actually on faculty at Temple when I was there. But you opened the text by devoting it to Nelson Lichtenstein, of course, the great labor historian and social movements historian. But I mean, everybody that you engaged there, tell us a little bit about what that was like, that intense kind of formation with some of the cutting, and then Rod Bush. I mean, there's so many other people you encounter along the way that find their way into this text. Could you say a little bit about those influences? Yeah,
I'm very happy to, because that really continues exactly this point, that is the teachers, right, that are just so important to how we come to our ideas. And so after that kind of time in Vancouver with Jack O'Dell and Karen Ferguson, I then went to graduate school at UC Santa Barbara. And I worked, and Nelson Lichtenstein was my advisor, the great labor historian. And incidentally, just last week, I was at a wonderful conference celebrating his career, because he's just retired. It was really nice to get a chance to do that. But of course, at UC Santa Barbara, I also had the opportunity to work with Cedric Robinson and George Lipsitz, Howard Winan, Alice O'Connor, a number of just, incredible mentors and scholars. And of course, we are all diminished by the loss of Cedric Robinson. Like Nikhil Singh's book on Jack O'Dell, I'm so grateful to Joshua Myers for publishing that incredible biography of Cedric Robinson. It's so nice to have that.
I should mention, John, that I put Black Marxism in Josh's hand during a study abroad when he was an undergraduate at Howard. Now that's how he got introduced to Cedric Robinson. So it comes full circle.
Well done.
Yeah, man. No. I mean, but to your point in terms of teachers, in fact, but you engage just about every scholar I'm aware of anyway on this period and on the question of radicalism, on the question of Popular Front, a concept that you kind of use to as a lens, the Anticolonial Front. Could you, before we take our first break, give us a sense? You state 4 theses at the beginning of the book that you say kind of frame your project. Could you mention, as folks are beginning to think about this book, what those major theses are?
Yeah, great. Let me mention them, and then maybe we can unpack them a little bit after that. And just very quickly before I do that, just because you mentioned Rod Bush, another person we're sad that we've lost, because I met him at a seminar in New York, and he was just again, just such a generous and wonderful scholar. So I just wanted to get that in there as well. Absolutely. So let me just say quickly to answer your question about the arguments. Yeah, that's right. There's four arguments to the book. One is that Black radical internationalism and anti-colonialism persisted despite anti-communism. That would be the first. That was sort of the first main argument that sort of pulls the other arguments together. But the other arguments I feel are important as well. That Black anti-fascism in the United States is also an anti-colonialism. And we can unpack that a little bit, but just to get them on the table for now. I also have an argument about Black liberals in that their relationship to U.S. empire and anti-imperialism was kind of a complicated one. There's a debate there, probably best represented by Gerald Horne on the one hand and Carol Anderson on the other. And I kind of try to formulate a sort of third position in relation to this question of Black liberalism. And finally, the relationship between colonialism and the Cold War. That's the kind of largest, most global sort of argument that I want to engage in. In retrospect, not necessarily as thoroughly as I might have, because I was still thinking about that one. But I wanted to say something about the way that the Cold War is sort of gets all the attention in terms of global dynamics after World War II, but actually it's the colonial, anti-colonial dynamic that matters the most.
Thank you, John. That's perfect. And when we come back, in a moment, we will continue our conversation with you with Professor John Munro, the University of Birmingham, on his book, The Anticolonial Front. Back in a moment at the Black Table.
For decades, the tobacco industry has deliberately targeted Black communities and kids with marketing for menthol cigarettes. It's had a devastating impact on Black health. Tobacco use claims 45,000 Black lives every year. It's the #1 cause of preventable death. In the 1950s, less than 10% of Black smokers used menthol cigarettes. Today, it's 85%. Menthol cools and numbs the throat, making it easier for kids to start smoking. Menthol also increases addiction, making it harder for smokers to quit. Menthol cigarettes are a big reason why Black Americans have a harder time quitting smoking and die at higher rates from smoking-related diseases like cancer, heart disease, and stroke. It's time to stop Big Tobacco from profiting off Black lives. An FDA ban on menthol cigarettes will improve Black health, save lives, and protect future generations from addiction. Learn more at tobaccofreekids.org/ban menthol.
I'm Deborah Owens, America's Wealth Coach, and my new show, Get Wealthy, focuses on the things that your financial advisor and bank isn't telling you, but you absolutely need to know. So watch Get Wealthy on the Black Star Network.
We're back at the Black Table. Greg Carr, Black Star Network, joined today by John Munro, professor at the University of Birmingham and the author of The Anticolonial Front. The Anticolonial Front. When we left, John, you had just laid out the four kind of broad framing theses that frame your book. And I hope that before we get into chapter 1, you might take a little bit more time and kind of articulate how you came to those theses, because you're right. I mean, as I was reading, of course, and your footnotes are just remarkable, and a lot of this archival research, but also the secondary literature you poured through. You are a very generous scholar. In other words, whatever differences you have, you take what you can from folks who have written, who have talked, who have worked, and then you say, okay, but this is what I'm going to suggest. And you're right. Immediately between Carol Anderson with Bourgeois Radicals and Gerald Horne, you don't really, could you walk us through this? And for folks who might not know what we're talking about so far, one of the things that you really emphasize is you can't understand here in the United States, for example, Brown versus Board of Education, the Montgomery bus boycott, any of the so-called civil rights movement, without framing it against what is happening in the world after the end of World War II, the formation of the international imperial structures that kind of renew themselves, the UN, the World Bank, the International Money Fund, however you want to put it, and all of the anti-colonial movements that are opposing the colonial reconfiguration that happens after World War II. Could you help us understand why that period from 1945 to the 1960s is so important, and why we don't talk about it as much as we should? Because, you know, here in the US, we think about boycotts and marches, and it's like you can't understand that without the global context.
Yeah, great. That's a great question. It's a lot to connect. I would maybe start by saying that the anti-colonial struggle resumes the very day that World War II ends. So when victory in Europe is being celebrated with the surrender of the Nazis, that very day, Algerians begin to mobilize and march for independence in May of 1945. In the Pacific Theater, the very day World War II ends, as the Japanese forces are signing the instrument of surrender in Tokyo Bay. That's the very day that Ho Chi Minh in Batting Square in Hanoi proclaims Vietnamese independence. So this international context that you're talking about, I agree. Of course, it's hugely important, and it begins immediately. I mean, kind of symbolically in that sense, on the very day that World War II ends in each theater. So this frames and kind of connects a number of issues that are happening in the United States. And of course, the Black freedom struggle in the United States, you know, as your viewers will know very well, does not begin with Brown versus Board of Education. The Black radical tradition and other traditions of Black resistance go, you know, back to 1619, if you want to date them to there, but in different sort of articulations over time. So what I would say is you have these two intertwined challenges to white supremacy in the global arena: the anti-colonial struggle in the global South and the Black freedom movement in the United States. To answer the other part of your question, I would say, why are these phenomena less connected, or are not always as strongly connected as they might be? I mean, one way it kind of makes sense is that we often understand things in a national frame, and there are things to be seen by understanding African American history in a U.S. national frame. There's important dimensions that that could get blurred out if we're only and always situating things in the global context. But that said, there's been a lot of attention within the national context, and I feel like one useful way to think about it, and again, this is very much a lesson from Jack Odell and others that I've learned, is that the global context matters for thinking about national histories in any number of situations.
Okay. Well, the first 4 chapters, you introduce us to a number of figures whose names we know very broadly, and then so many more whose names are lesser known. And in fact, when you begin chapter 1 with W.E.B. Du Bois and Black Reconstruction in America, one of his lesser known works, as we both know, folks think of the souls of Black folk as if, wow, that was like a lot of years before Du Bois. But by the time we finish those first 4 chapters, you've taken us from Du Bois and the anti-colonial movement that is moving. And in chapter 2, you go to the 5th Pan-African Congress in Manchester and give us a peek as to what's going on in England with these African students and so many other folks, which, by the way, found fascinating, this preliminary meeting that was proposed by Du Bois at the Schomburg Center, which was fascinating because there are a lot of Howard University faculty who respond there, in terms of William Leo Hansberry and others. And then chapter 3, you draw attention to something that I think some of our viewers have probably never heard of: the first SNCC, the student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee is the second SNCC. I mean, you got the Southern Negro Youth Conference, and a very important lecture that Dr. Du Bois gave on the campus, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it was Benedict College in Columbia, South Carolina, Behold the Land. I think about contemporary in Georgia and Mississippi and people saying, you can't flip the South. Du Bois said the future of America is in the South, to these radical students, and Adam Clayton Powell and others who are there, these formations. And then that last chapter in this first cluster, when you talk about Marxist anti-colonialism, you focus in on some very important publications, Paul Robeson's Freedom, of course, Political Affairs, which, you know, the house organ in some ways of the Communist Party USA, and then the Crisis magazine. I mean, help us understand how these figures who we often hear about, Paul Robeson, W.E.B. Du Bois, Jackie Robinson, who we'll talk about a bit later, how they connect to this larger world and how we really can't understand what we're usually taught in this country about them without placing them in this context you've placed them in.
Yeah, great. Again, a lot of things to connect up here, but I think Dr. Du Bois is at the center of much of this. And, it's interesting, you write a book and then some time passes. And then if you think back on it, because, when I was so grateful to get your invitation to speak with you, I was thinking, okay, I got to think, to the book. It's been a little while since it was published.
Sure.
And I feel like one of the through lines of the book is actually Black Reconstruction. I kind of begin that first chapter with it, and it keeps coming up in different places. And the analysis that Du Bois puts forward there, of course, again, clearly one of the most important generative social histories we have, full stop. But that also puts abolition democracy during Reconstruction in a very international context and looks at it very much as a challenge to imperialism as well as a challenge to white supremacy in the South. And so there's, a connection there to his Behold the Land speech in 1946, in which he's arguing exactly as you say, the South is the center of this, and the fight must be won in the South, but also in order for that larger global struggle to also be successful as well. So, and Du Bois, of course, is in Manchester. So his papers, for other researchers who are looking at this that may already know, but if you don't, Du Bois's papers is one, wonderful source that kind of brings a lot of this stuff together, particularly through Du Bois's correspondence, because he was the one who was, corresponding with so many figures every day, basically throughout and well beyond this period. Now, those publications you mentioned, those were crucial to me for exactly establishing this ongoing, this kind of continuity of resistance that takes place, because of course those years of McCarthyism were really hard on progressive, leftist, anti-racist, internationalist activists. And Paul Robeson, of course, and W.E.B. Du Bois are among the most famous for having their passports taken away. Others like C.L.R. James and Claudia Jones were, of course, deported. Esther Cooper Jackson and James Jackson's family suffered, directly through repression within the country. There are, of course, many examples of this. So the question becomes then, how do you explain and how do you track as a historian this ongoing conversation? And I feel like those three publications, that each one has a distinct politics from the other, are real ways of kind of bridging those years and showing that the African American focus on issues of imperialism is absolutely a through line throughout this whole period of McCarthyism. McCarthyism does not shut this down.
So John, okay, help me, because there's gonna be a lot of people who say, when I think NAACP, I think voting rights, I think, but you attach the NAACP through the crisis and beyond to the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. I think a lot of times when people think about the civil rights movement in the United States, we don't think about it in an international context. This may be, for example, the first time some people have heard of the Pan-African Congress as a concept in Manchester. So could you help us? And then, of course, overarching all of this, some people may say, what's McCarthyism? There's this anti-communist thrust in the United States. Could you help us understand the kind of the fact that all of these organizations, regardless of their individual political positions, kind of all were working in this global struggle? Because we usually don't think about them that way, at least not in the kind of conventional narrative.
Yeah, another great question. So I would say for your viewers, one shorthand way of thinking about McCarthyism is just to think of it as the critical race theory paranoia of the 1950s, like a certain figure, the critical race theory today, communism back then, that's essentially mobilized to shut down any challenges to a given system of power, to shut down any challenges to the gendered, racial, and class ordering of things in a society like the United States. So that's kind of the work that it's distinct and different, but I think that works as a comparison, I think, just in the way that it's meant to shut down any kind of opposition or even reform, not even just radical challenge, but even moderate challenge as well. So this is how these distinct traditions work then, and how they all are managing to continue this conversation. So briefly, I would say, for the Communist Party, and that's through the magazine Political Affairs. So they are, they're relentless in their criticism of capitalism, imperialism, and the United States, of course, the capitalist imperialist system within the United States. Paul Robeson's Freedom shares many of those commitments, but they have a more specific anti-racist sort of agenda, which you can see more prominently. So it's not that they necessarily disagree, but the emphasis is different. And I think this is why Freedom is such a remarkable and generative work to look at, because it's fundamentally an anti-racist publication of the Black freedom movement that very much has a critique of capitalism and imperialism. Now, the crisis, the NAACP, so this is where the Black liberals come in, and white liberals who are writing for this publication as well. And as Carol Anderson has shown, there's, we might be a bit surprised to see the extent of the critique of apartheid, of the European imperialist powers. But where that critique kind of stops short, it's not that the critique isn't there and that McCarthyism ends it and shuts it down, but where it stops short is on criticizing capitalism, usually, and also criticizing the United States directly. That's where you would see a really significant difference in terms of, say, political affairs criticizing the US and the NAACP. Of course, the flip side of that is that political affairs is very short on critiques of Stalinism and the Soviet Union, whereas the crisis is, of course, very willing to go there and make those criticisms as well.
Yes. Well, we're going to pause here, John, just for a second to take a break. And when we come back, let's dig deep in that, because when you get to chapter 5, you really do put this on the table, this confrontation with some of the contradictions here in the United States that these freedom fighters are fighting. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. When we come back here, the Black Table, Black Star Network, Greg Carr, back in a moment.
Put 10 in here?
10, and you don't come out till you die. And you eat him, you eat 10.
Oh my God.
So
Big Tobacco targets Black communities with marketing for menthol cigarettes. In the 1950s, less than 10% used menthol cigarettes. Today, it's 85%. FDA, ban menthol cigarettes, save lives.
Welcome back to the Black Table. We are deep into a conversation with Professor John Munro, author of the book, The Anticolonial Front. And when we left, Prof, we were coming into your chapter 5, Resilient Resistance, the Uneven Impact of Anti-Communism. And could you kind of help us, before we get to chapter 6 in the Bandung world, all of these actors, like you say, Paul Robeson, and you talked about a little bit in terms of the Smith Act. You talk about how they're called before Congress. If it's Claudia Jones or CLR James, they're deported. But there are even some characters in this drama whose names we know probably better than any of these folks, like Jackie Robinson and Langston Hughes. Could you talk about what the climate was like in the 50s with this McCarthyism and the Smith Act, and how this really, this attack on freedom movements and social movements in the United States has to be placed in this larger context?
Yeah, it's hard to imagine just how difficult it must have been, especially for Black figures in the United States who are dealing with, who are trying to have careers, and live their lives under the conditions of open white supremacy on the one hand, and then anti-communism on the other, combining to, again, in an attempt to stifle any kind of critique. So we might say more moderate figures like Jackie Robinson is trying to negotiate this and navigate this, and and obviously later has some regrets about how that went in terms of what happened to Paul Robeson, for instance, and the ways that Black, intellectuals, artists, athletes were made to the price of the ticket, was that they had to some degree, at least outwardly, conform with the kind of the Cold War order, I guess we would say. So I feel like the first thing is just to try to emphasize just how difficult it must have been for everybody. And it would be really easy for somebody like me again, a white guy from Canada in the 21st century saying, oh, this person wasn't sufficiently brave in the face of this. That doesn't seem like a very productive way to approach this, but rather to just try to understand the politics of the moment and how people got through them. That said, remarkable bravery was also very much in evidence on a number of these figures. I mean, Robeson, we take anybody you like, but Robeson is a classic example, as you know so well. He was, one of the greatest celebrities and intellectuals and artists and most recognized of his age. And for him to be such a critic, to such a degree, and obviously the impact that had, the negative impact that had on his career, his mental health, it's something to behold. I was part of, I just mentioned briefly that when I lived in Vancouver, I was part of a group of people who did an oral history around the when Paul Robeson came to the US-Canada border.
Yes.
And sang, and we had an event to sort of mark the 50th anniversary of that. And Danny Glover came and he gave the same speech that Robeson gave back at the time. And it was just, absolutely so moving and so remarkable. So this was the politics of the moment, and this was how a number of these figures, Jack O'Dell and Claudia Jones, of course, is deported. But what does she do when she gets to the UK? Resumes organizing, founds the Carnival, becomes one of the most important figures in the anti-racist fight there as well. Yeah. So this global dimension matters, and many of the activists in the Black freedom struggle continue to insist on its importance throughout this whole period, despite the real difficulties that were put in front of them.
Absolutely. In fact, let's take it international for the remaining few minutes of this block. And of course, because this is everywhere, streaming everywhere, shout out to the homies in Notting Hill and the Carnival and Claudia Jones, who, as we know, Carol Boyce Davies in her book reminds us, is buried in the same cemetery left of Karl Marx, literally. So, man, but by the time when you dig into the Afro-Asian Conference, the Bandung Conference, Bandung World. I mean, think about, Malcolm X, who was in prison as part of this, listening to Paul Robeson recordings, modeling speech after Paul Robeson, friends with Adam Clayton Powell, who is, finds himself caught up there. And then Richard Wright writes a whole book could you talk a little bit, not only about the Afro-Asian Conference and the meaning of the Bandung World, with a lot of leaders whose names we know, but then in the following chapter, one of the folk who is involved in the Pan-African Conference of 1945, Kwame Nkrumah, sends a call out for everybody to come home, and Alphaeus Hunton and Dorothy Hunton and then Du Bois's and Maya Angelou end up in Ghana of all places. And then by the time you walk us through that, could you help us understand and continue to expand that global network that you so brilliantly map out in these chapters?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, the connections from Bandung to Accra are multiple, from Indonesia to Ghana. And, this conference in Indonesia, it's so important. It's the decolonizing world announcing their agenda, announcing their presence, insisting on the importance of colonialism, and challenging both of the superpowers to kind of reframe, we might say, global politics away from an East-West conception of, capitalist West versus communist East, but to a North-South, a more familiar to today's world, a North-South kind of conception of global North, global South, again, putting that imperial dynamic very much to the fore. I mean, the participants at Bandung were, they certainly were not in one mind about any number of things. How could they be? They had different perceptions. Zhou Enlai from China is there, for example, like very much part of the communist world. The representatives from the Philippines are more allied with the United States. There's all kinds of, no shortage of tensions, but nonetheless, an insistence. And again, just to think about the importance of putting racism front and center in world politics, as a shaping global force. it's really significant. And so, of course, Kwame Nkrumah, the Ghanaian activist who had spent time in the United States, of course, as well previously, and was at the Manchester Congress. Kwame Nkrumah, goes on to lead. So he's engaged in the struggle, of course, against British imperialism, which is ultimately successful in 1957. And that independence celebration alone, even just the moment of independence, Dr. King goes to see for himself, and he's very struck by what he sees as well.
And Louis Armstrong, which I always find fascinating, man. I mean, what do you think it was like, John, for Richard Nixon to be the U.S. delegate, and he gets there and finds all these Negroes from the United States hanging out with their African cousins? That must have sent a shockwave through as you write about. I mean, what's the response? I mean, because you talk about the kind of propaganda campaign the United States tries to mount to kind of blunt some of this.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's that story, it might be apocryphal, but about Richard Nixon. He turns to two black gentlemen in Ghana and says, "How does it feel to be free?" And the answer is, "We don't know. We're from Alabama," because of course African Americans are there as well, right? Wow. So yeah, absolutely. It's an absolute kind of nodal point in global racial politics at this time, and precisely as you say, people begin to flock there to see and to participate in this new society. George Padmore, Malcolm X, Shirley Graham Du Bois, many people go there to see it, but also to help build it and to make a kind of a new society that might do something different from all of these centuries that have led to the racial capitalist order at that point. Ultimately it's overthrown, of course, but there's that moment. It's important to hold that before getting to the story of the overthrow. There's that moment from 57 to 66 in which real possibilities are there.
Yeah, I'm astonished at your ability to weave everybody. I mean, you mentioned Carter Woodson, of course, who ironically becomes caught up in U.S. empire building in the Philippines as a young man, as a teacher in the Philippines. But that period that you mentioned, again, all these young people, Julian Mayfield and Maya Angelou, so many others, David Levering Lewis, who ends up going there. But could you mention, as a name you mentioned that some of our folk may not be as familiar with, and that's the brother from Trinidad, George Padmore. Could you say a little bit, because you write a lot about Padmore in here. Could you say a little bit more about him?
Yeah, Padmore is really important. So he's in Manchester again in 1945. He'd already been an activist. He'd been in the U.S. before that. He'd been in Germany before World War II as well. And a couple of things about Padmore are really significant. So Padmore is an anti-fascist who sees fascism as a kind of colonialism. Many on the left, of course, many liberals are obviously anti-fascist during World War II. It's the war against the Nazis, of course. But what Padmore is careful to do is to say, okay, yes, this is an enemy that must be fought, and he's a very principled anti-fascist. But let's not let something like British imperialism off the hook as we do that. Let's rather see, without collapsing them into the same thing, the British Empire is not Nazi Germany, but let's see the kinds of structural resonances between them and insist on those as part of our politics. So he's just incredible at weaving a kind of nuanced, but nonetheless but very well explained sort of politics throughout. And he goes to Ghana, and he's a really important figure and really close to Kwame Nkrumah in building the new Ghanaian society after 1957.
And then, as you say, John, and this is, I think, is interesting, bringing it kind of full circle as we kind of tease what we're going to talk about in the final block. You begin this work, as you say, close reading of Penny Von Eschen's Race Against Empire with the Council of African Affairs with Jack O'Dell. The illusion in some ways that the anti-communist movement in the United States and Great Britain, wherever, smashes all this momentum. It doesn't come to an end, does it? I mean, it does survive, but what happens there as these kind of forces begin to convene against these anti-colonial forces that are also convening?
Yeah. So should we take that up after the break, or have we got a minute for that now?
Yeah, that's right. In fact, yeah, that's right. Hey, you all.
That's a great question.
Well, it's a 300-page book, and you ought to get the Anti-Colonial Front. Trust me, it's well worth it. So yes, when we come back, we'll pick up with that with Professor John Munro, his book, The Anti-Colonial Front, The African-American Freedom Struggle and Global Decolonization, 1945 to 1960. Back in a moment at the Black Table.
Hi, I'm Dr. Jackie Hood Martin, and I have a question for you. Ever feel as if your life is teetering and the weight and pressure of the world is consistently on your shoulders? Well, let me tell you, living a balanced life isn't easy. Join me each Tuesday on Black Star Network for a Balanced Life with Dr. Jackie. We'll laugh together, cry together, pull ourselves together, and cheer each other on. So join me for new shows each Tuesday on Black Star Network, A Balanced Life with Dr. Jackie.
We're back at the Black Table in our final segment session with Professor John Munro, University of Birmingham. And when we left, we were just about to get into the reaction to this global anti-colonial movement. There were a lot of Black people involved, but there were a lot of non-Black people involved. So, John, help us, man. What happens to this movement? Because a lot of people are hearing about this movement for the first time, man.
Yeah, sure. I mean, you can see, people like Stokely Carmichael would be a good example, who bring these politics forward, who as a young person are around kind of Communist Party circles and bring these kind of politics forward into the 1960s. The Black Panther Party, of course, is a great example of kind of continuation of this. Malcolm X is, among other things, a great internationalist, and obviously the influence of his politics, can't be, you can't say enough about the influence there, of course. One place I would point to, but to see a bit more specifically the kind of political formation I'm talking about, calling the Anti-Colonial Front and its resonance. One place I would look would be a speech that Martin Luther King gives on the 23rd of February, 1968, on the occasion of the 100-year anniversary of W.E.B. Du Bois's birth. So Du Bois, of course, passed away in Ghana in 1963, but in 68, Dr. King is asked to speak about Dr. Du Bois. And what does he talk about? Black Reconstruction. That's what the talk is about. And it's a conference. It is also a meeting, and it was a meeting that was organized in part by Jack O'Dell as well, and the Freedom Ways group, who comes sort of kind of another generation coming out of the Freedom publication, are there. And it's widely available. People can look it up, the speech that Martin Luther King gives there. But
in fact, I think they published it in, was it after they did it in Freedom Ways, it came out in Black Titan, was it honoring Dr. Du Bois?
Yeah, there you go. Exactly. And how does he honor Dr. Du Bois? But by talking about Black Reconstruction. And again, it's kind of, critique of capitalism and internationalist vision, which of course, Dr. King all the more embodied by this time, given his criticisms of the Vietnam War. So I feel like that would be one, if you want just one, text that sort of brings some of this together in the later 1960s, I think that would be a good example, as well, of course, as the ongoing beyond that activism of Jack O'Dell to the end and beyond of the entire century.
In fact, that's perfect, John, as we kind of begin to wind things up. At the end, in the epilogue of the book, you talk about, you raise this, you make this assertion. You say, if neoliberal times are imperial times, there are also tragedies. And you talk about the fact that, the price of freedom, the price of liberation is really struggle. And the tragedy in some ways is the price of freedom as well. Could you talk a little bit about how you see the contemporary world and movements? You talk about, for example, Great Britain and the United States coming together. And we had Maribel Mori on a few weeks ago in her book, White Philanthropy. She talks about Andrew Carnegie and how they wanted to have this Anglo world come together. And here we are in 2022, and we're seeing these kind of global imperial formations continue to try to keep people oppressed. And the legacy of the Anti-Colonial Front isn't just the 60s and 70s. Could you talk about how you see that new iterations of it coming today? Because you write about some of that at the end of the book.
Yeah, gladly. I mean, I would think that uh, George W. Bush and Tony Blair's war against Iraq is an excellent example of that, a more recent example of that Anglo world in action. And what better sort of lens to view that through than one of anti-imperialist critique, So I feel like, yeah, I've written a book about, these figures, but I'm mostly a student of them, really. They have a lot to teach us about contemporary politics, as well as, they're interesting figures to think about an era in history, and that's important too. But I feel like a critique of gendered racial capitalism, and to see neoliberalism through that lens as well. We too often, I feel, see neoliberalism as solely a kind of articulation of capitalism. And of course it is, but to understand capitalism without race, for instance, is just to diminish our analysis and make us less able to challenge the kinds of, inequalities that we might want to contest. So I feel like seeing neoliberalism in an imperial context as an ongoing, it's not the same thing, but it's only understandable as a more contemporary manifestation of these longer standing, centuries long imperial kinds of relations, is a way to think through and contest. To have hope in this moment is to learn from some of the people that we're talking about here today, I think.
Absolutely. And one of those people, of course, a man you are able to apprentice with, he and his partner there, Jack Odell, as you mentioned. You write about his democracy charter. I wonder if you mind saying a few words about what that was, as it speaks to this greater vision of humanity beyond race, beyond class, but certainly grounded in the realities. But what is the democracy charter Jack Odell articulating? How does that capture some of these struggles that we're fighting today?
Yeah, great. I mean, it's a kind of political program that he put forward. Some of us organized a conference in his honor in 2005, which Bill Fletcher gave the keynote at, and was a really nice event. And there and in some other places. And there's also, I should importantly note, in the book that Nikhil Pal Singh has edited, there's a copy of it in there, so your listeners can check that out, and I recommend that they do. And it's essentially a kind of, I would maybe call it, Jack Odell was sort of a child of the New Deal era, and it's sort of bringing forward some of the social democratic spirit of that era. But I would say, very much imbued with more kind of more significant political content in terms of, again, drawing together these structures, which sometimes we think of as racism, capitalism, homophobia, sexism, and to think about the way that if we have a concern about any of them, if we have an opposition to any of them, then we need to think about them together. And that's the kind of, with a program that sort of demands, that's what the Democracy Charter puts forward. And I feel like it's a really significant document for all of us to study and discuss and debate as well, not necessarily just to read and agree with.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I want to take just a minute or two, because while you're teaching across the pond, you're actually traveling among other places this summer here in the States, to ask you about what you're working on now. Because I know, as Duke Ellington often says, one of those guys with Dizzy Gillespie and Louis Armstrong, they tried to send out to blunt edge some of this stuff. But in the 50s, you said, well, what's your favorite work that you're working on, Duke? He's the next one. So what you working on, man?
I would say that a few different things, but the key thing I would say is I'm working on a project that I'm really excited about. It's called the Imperialism Syllabus. And this was something that appeared in digital form on the Public Books website. And myself with a friend and colleague, Radhika Natarajan, who's a historian at Reed College. She's a historian of the British Empire. I'm a historian, of course, of the United States. And it's a public sort of document that appears online, and it's a way of just sort of drawing together some themes about imperialism and suggesting some readings in reference to them. But we're starting to work on kind of shaping this into a book, and it'll be an interesting kind of book because it's meant really for popular engagement. And so we'll be writing up sort of encapsulations of the different themes that we looked at, slavery, settler colonialism, the Cold War, a bunch of different themes that can be connected through thinking about imperialism. So we're working on that, and I will be meeting with Radhika and bringing that project forward. So that's the main next thing at the moment.
Oh, thank you, John. In fact, I was thinking about this in terms of using the Anticolonial Front in the classroom and all kind of exercises came to mind. And one of them I thought about was, have students don't touch anything in the book but the index. Go through the index and check off all the names and then say a little bit about why you know them. So, I mean, Lorraine Hansberry is in there. Mary McLeod Bethune is in. These are names we know. And then as we go through the book, find out how your vision of it would change. Let me ask you, have you gotten any feedback from folk who have used the book in the classroom or as a teacher yourself? How have your students kind of reacted to the themes you bring up, the scholarship you've done and the connections you've made? And do you have any words for students, and not just people who are in formal education, but folks just learning generally about how to, undertake this study to understand the relationship between this historical research and our contemporary struggles?
Yeah, I mean, that index exercise is wonderful, Greg. Thanks for what a neat way to approach any book, really. So I'll be taking that, among other things we've talked about. That'll be one of the things I'll be taking away with me here. But I mean, yeah, I would hope that if people are using it in the classroom, that they can talk through exactly some of the things following from your great questions here around making these connections. People know that there was a civil rights movement in the United States. Like my students in the UK certainly know that. And they also know that England had an empire, but they don't necessarily think that there's a relationship between those two things. So I think like kind of some of that connective work, and again, with a mind towards how we're going to challenge these things in the present, as you and I are talking in the wake of several horrific instances of gun violence in Buffalo and in Texas, for example. What are we going to do about this? How are we going to contest this stuff? And when it seems so hopeless. And I feel like looking to some of the figures and some of the examples of people who also worked and operated under very, very difficult circumstances politically are places we might look.
Yes. Very powerful way to end it for now, John. And I hope you will join us again, brother, because I had a whole line of questions even around just Lorraine Hansberry that I wish we could have gotten to. So if you can squeeze out another hour to spend with us at some point down the line, I hope you'll come back and join us. But thank you for the time you spent today and for this remarkable work and for your life of study and practice to date. Thank you for joining us, John.
Oh, well, my pleasure. What an absolute, again, honor and treat it is to get a chance to talk with you. Thanks again for such perceptive and wonderful questions.
Oh, no, with pleasure, man. Work like this deserves people to pay serious attention to it. So, man, thanks again. Okay, well, we've been joined by Professor John Munro of Birmingham University. We've been discussing his book, The Anticolonial Front. I encourage everyone to get this book, to read it, to study it. And we will be back at the Black Table in a moment. We'll clear the table and get ready for next week. Back in a moment, the Black Table, Black Star Network. Welcome back to the Black Table, Black Star Network. We've spent the last hour with Professor John Munro, author of The Anticolonial Front, a remarkable piece of work that reminds us that all of our local lives, our struggles, they really are influenced by the lives and struggles of human beings all over the world. We've just passed, in fact, the anniversary of the killing of George Floyd 2 years ago. George Perry Floyd Jr., the North Carolina-born, Texas-bred son of Larcenia Sissy Jones Floyd and George Perry Sr., and father of Gianna Floyd, was murdered by police while calling for his mother in front of Cup Foods, a pawn shop near the corner of 38th Street and Chicago Avenue in South Minneapolis, Minnesota. His murder, coming on the heels of the murders of Breonna Taylor in Louisville, Kentucky, and Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia, set off an international movement. It was called the summer of 2020, The Reckoning. And we know that it was international and it was connected because George Floyd wasn't just murdered on the 25th of May, which is Memorial Day in the United States, a ritual which was started May the 1st, 1865 in Charleston, South Carolina by Black folk honoring the Union soldiers who had helped fight in the liberation struggle of African people. We heard Professor Munro talk about W.E.B. Du Bois's 1935 book, Black Reconstruction in America. It's worth a read today, perhaps now even more than ever. So George Floyd wasn't just murdered on Memorial Day in the United States. He was also killed on African Liberation Day, which is May 25th. 1963, when the Organization of Afro-American Unity was started, but it goes back to African Freedom Day, which was celebrated in April because of Kwame Nkrumah, who we heard Professor Munro talk about, who he's written about extensively. And if you remember, in an earlier episode of The Black Table, we had Professor Abdullah Kalimat, who writes about the African Liberation Support Committee. In other words, today's episode of The Black Table is particularly important because as we think about George Floyd in the United States, we must understand that George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, all the victims of violence, whether they be in Buffalo or Texas or California, are all part of a larger global violence that we must all resist all the time. And the more we coordinate, the more we connect, as we've seen in this book, The Anticolonial Front, the more we connect, the more certain is our victory. So join us next week at The Black Table. I'm Greg Carr, the Black Star Network. Looking forward